Albert Camus' philosophy is often introduced through the language of the absurd, but the absurd is only the starting point. What ultimately concerns Camus is not meaninglessness itself, but what meaninglessness demands of us. If the world offers no final answers, no moral guarantees, and no transcendent order that ensures justice, then responsibility does not disappear. It becomes heavier. It falls entirely on human shoulders. Camus is suspicious of every doctrine that tries to lighten this burden. Religion offers divine judgment. Ideology offers historical necessity. Metaphysics offers rational systems. Camus refuses all three. He insists that there is no higher court of appeal capable of absolving us in advance. We act without guarantees, and we remain responsible for what we do, even when circumstances are cruel, even when outcomes are tragic, even when there is no clean choice available. This refusal is what gives Camus' moral thought its severity. He does not promise redemption. He does not offer moral purity. He offers lucidity and limits. To live responsibly, for Camus, is to act without lying to oneself about what one is doing, and without hiding behind explanations that excuse harm. The experience that grounds this demand is the absurd. Camus defines the absurd as the confrontation between the human desire for meaning and the world's indifference to that desire. We ask why. The world remains silent. We seek justice. The world distributes suffering randomly. We want coherence. Reality gives us contingency and accident. This contradiction does not resolve. It is not a problem to be solved, but a condition to be lived. Crucially, the absurd does not cancel morality. It intensifies it. If there is no ultimate meaning built into the world, then meaning must be created through human action. If there is no divine justice waiting at the end of time, then human justice becomes more urgent, not less. The absence of guarantees strips away excuses. We cannot say, "It will all work out in the end," because there is no end that promises to redeem what we do now. This is why Camus begins The Myth of Sisyphus with the question of suicide. Suicide is not merely a personal decision for Camus, it is a judgment about the value of life itself. To commit suicide is to declare that life, confronted honestly, is not worth the effort of living. Camus rejects this judgment. He argues that the proper response to the absurd is not escape, but defiance. To live without appeal, without hope of resolution, is already a moral stance. This refusal to escape sets the foundation for Camus' conception of responsibility. Responsibility begins with staying alive, staying awake, staying honest about the difficulty of existence without trying to dissolve it through fantasy. Suicide, faith, and ideological certainty are all forms of escape for Camus. They relieve the individual of the burden of living without answers. Camus refuses that relief, but refusing escape does not mean embracing despair. Camus is not a nihilist. He does not believe that, because there is no ultimate meaning, anything goes. On the contrary, he believes that the absence of ultimate meaning imposes limits. If nothing can be justified absolutely, then no action can be justified without restraint. The absurd forbids absolutes. This is where Camus' moral responsibility begins to take shape. If there is no final truth that authorizes our actions, then every action must be measured against its human cost. We cannot appeal upward to God, outward to society, or forward to history to excuse ourselves. Responsibility remains immediate and personal. Camus is particularly hostile to the language of necessity. When someone says, "This had to be done," Camus hears an attempt to erase choice. Necessity functions as an alibi. It allows individuals to deny agency, and with it, guilt. Camus insists that even under extreme pressure, human beings choose. To deny this is to deny moral responsibility itself. This insistence is not naive. Camus does not deny that circumstances constrain us. He does not pretend that all choices are equal. He insists only that constraint does not abolish responsibility. Even when options are terrible, choosing between them remains a moral act. The absence of good choices does not excuse the harm caused by bad ones. This is why Camus is so wary of moral systems that promise justification in advance. Once an action is declared necessary, it is no longer judged. Ethics collapses into efficiency. The question, "Is this right?" is replaced by, "Does this work?" Responsibility dissolves into calculation. Camus' early fiction already dramatizes this danger. In The Stranger, Meursault does not justify his actions morally, he simply refuses to lie about them. His crime is not only murder, but indifference to the narratives society uses to make sense of guilt and innocence. Meursault's refusal to perform moral theatre unsettles the court more than the act itself. Camus is showing how deeply society depends on explanatory frameworks to stabilize responsibility. But Camus is not endorsing indifference. Meursault is not a moral ideal. He is a limit case. Through him, Camus exposes what happens when responsibility is stripped of meaning altogether. The result is not freedom, but emptiness. Moral responsibility for Camus requires engagement, not withdrawal. This is why Camus' ethics always return to limits. Responsibility means refusing to cross certain lines, even when crossing them would be effective. It means accepting that some actions are forbidden, not because they fail to achieve goals, but because they violate human dignity. Camus does not define dignity metaphysically. He does not ground it in reason, soul, or divine image. Dignity emerges from shared vulnerability. Human beings suffer, hope, fear, and die. Responsibility begins with recognizing this shared condition and refusing to treat others as mere instruments. This recognition leads Camus to reject moral systems that subordinate individuals to abstractions. Whenever an idea demands sacrifice, Camus asks, who pays the price? Whenever a theory justifies suffering, Camus asks, whose suffering is being justified? Responsibility for Camus is the refusal to let abstraction override the concrete reality of human pain. This refusal becomes central in Camus' understanding of revolt. Revolt begins with a no. No to humiliation, no to arbitrary power, no to injustice. But this no is not purely negative. It implies a yes. Yes to a limit beyond which power may not go. Revolt affirms that there are boundaries that must not be crossed. For Camus, revolt is moral before it is political. It is not about overthrowing the world, but about refusing to accept certain conditions as normal. Revolt says that some forms of suffering are unacceptable, even if they are widespread, even if they are legally sanctioned, even if they are historically explained. This is where Camus' concept of responsibility diverges sharply from revolutionary ethics. Revolutionary thinking often seeks total transformation. It aims not only to resist injustice, but to remake humanity itself. In doing so, it tends to dissolve limits. Once everything must change, everything becomes permissible. Camus resists this logic. He believes that revolt must remain faithful to its origin. The moment revolt abandons limits, it becomes another form of domination. Responsibility vanishes when revolt turns into absolute authority. This concern is not abstract for Camus. It grows out of the 20th century's experience of mass violence, justified by ideas. Camus sees how easily suffering is rationalized when it serves a future goal. He sees how quickly victims disappear into statistics. Responsibility erodes as soon as harm is described as necessary. Camus insists that explanation does not absolve. One may explain why violence occurs without excusing it. To confuse explanation with justification is to abandon ethics entirely. Responsibility means refusing to let explanation become permission. This refusal places Camus in a difficult position. He does not offer programs or blueprints. He does not promise that responsible action will succeed. He insists only that irresponsible action will fail morally, even if it succeeds politically. This is why Camus' ethics are often described as tragic. He does not believe history can be redeemed. He does not believe suffering can be eliminated. He believes only that human beings can refuse to make suffering worse in the name of making it better. Responsibility in this sense is not heroic. It does not lead to glory. It leads to vigilance. It requires constant attention to what one is doing and why. It demands that one remain awake to the cost of one's actions, even when those actions are applauded. Camus's moral responsibility therefore begins not with certainty but with doubt, not with solutions but with refusal. Refusal to lie, refusal to kill indiscriminately, refusal to surrender judgment to systems that promise absolution. In this way, Camus prepares the ground for the political confrontations that will follow. His moral responsibility is already in place before he confronts revolution, terrorism, and history. It is forged in the absurd, tested in revolt, and defined by limits. What comes next is the question Camus cannot avoid. How does this responsibility survive when violence is no longer theoretical, when politics demands blood, and when history insists that hesitation is betrayal? That question will force Camus out of abstraction and into conflict. That is where the second half begins. The moral responsibility Camus develops through the absurd and revolt does not remain philosophical for long. It is forced into the open by politics, violence, and history. Once responsibility is tested under conditions where blood is shed and lives are lost, moral principles can no longer hide behind abstraction. This is where Camus' ethics become most difficult and where he becomes most isolated. Camus understands that modern politics places extraordinary pressure on moral judgment. The 20th century did not merely produce injustice, it produced justifications for injustice. Violence was no longer explained as tragic failure, but defended as historical necessity. Entire systems arose that demanded obedience not only to laws, but to narratives about the future. To resist these narratives was to resist history itself. Camus rejects this framing. For him, history is not a moral authority. It has no conscience, no capacity for remorse, no ability to distinguish between crime and justice. History describes what happens. It does not justify what happens. To treat history as a source of moral legitimacy is to surrender responsibility to a force that cannot be held accountable. This surrender is deeply tempting. It offers relief. If history demands an action, then the individual is no longer responsible for choosing it. Guilt dissolves into inevitability. Violence becomes something that happens rather than something that is done. Camus sees this as the central moral evasion of modern politics. This is why Camus's conflict with revolutionary ideology is unavoidable. Revolutionary movements often claim that present suffering will be redeemed by future justice. They promise that violence now will eliminate violence later. Camus regards this promise as both unprovable and morally corrupting. A future that does not yet exist cannot answer for the suffering demanded in its name. For Camus, the decisive question is always the same. What happens to responsibility when murder is justified in advance? His answer is uncompromising. Once murder is justified by an idea, responsibility disappears. The killer no longer sees himself as a moral agent, but as an instrument. Ethics collapses into function. This is the core argument of the rebel. Camus traces how rebellion, which begins as a protest against injustice, can transform into revolution, which claims absolute authority. Rebellion begins by saying no to humiliation. Revolution often ends by saying yes to unlimited power. The moment revolt claims the right to remake humanity, it abandons the limits that made it morally meaningful in the first place. Camus insists that limits are not weaknesses. They are safeguards. Without limits, revolt becomes indistinguishable from tyranny. Without limits, power expands until nothing restrains it. Responsibility evaporates when everything is permitted. This insistence on limits places Camus at odds with thinkers who equate responsibility with commitment to a cause. Jean-Paul Sartre is the most famous example. Sartre increasingly argued that one must choose sides in history, and that refusal to support revolutionary violence amounted to complicity with oppression. Neutrality, in this view, is itself a moral failure. Camus rejects this accusation. He argues that responsibility does not consist in choosing the correct side of history. It consists in refusing to excuse cruelty. One can oppose injustice without granting oneself permission to murder indiscriminately. One can resist oppression without surrendering judgment. Camus does not deny that political action is often tragic. He does not pretend that moral purity is possible. He insists only that tragedy does not license murder. To accept tragedy is not to glorify it. Responsibility means acting without transforming necessity into virtue. The hostility Camus faced after publishing The Rebel reveals how threatening this position was. He was accused of moralism, of refusing to dirty his hands, of standing above the struggle while others suffered. But Camus understood that the language of dirty hands often serves as a moral shortcut. It implies that seriousness requires blood and that restraint is childish. Camus reverses this logic. He argues that what is childish is the belief that violence can be made clean through theory. The refusal to kill is not immaturity, it is recognition of what killing means. Responsibility begins with acknowledging that murder cannot be undone by good intentions. This is why Camus is so concerned with intellectual responsibility. Intellectuals rarely commit violence directly, but they often justify it. They create the language that makes cruelty sound reasonable. They provide the moral alibis that allow others to act without guilt. Camus believes this makes intellectuals uniquely responsible for the atmosphere in which violence becomes possible. Explanation for Camus is not justification. One may explain the causes of violence without excusing it. To confuse explanation with justification is to collapse ethics into sociology. Responsibility requires that one retain the capacity to say, "This is wrong," even when it can be explained. This refusal becomes even more difficult when violence is committed in the name of justice. Camus does not deny that injustice provokes revolt. He denies that revolt must become murder. Once revolt accepts murder as normal, it loses its moral foundation. The Algerian War brings these principles into brutal focus. Camus opposed colonial injustice and supported reforms aimed at equality and dignity for Algerians. At the same time, he refused to endorse terrorism directed at civilians. This refusal made him unacceptable to both sides. Camus's famous statement about choosing his mother over justice is often misunderstood. It is not a rejection of justice, but a rejection of abstraction. Justice that demands the death of innocents is not justice. A politics that requires one to accept the murder of one's own mother as collateral damage has already abandoned responsibility. Camus's position here is not sentimental, it is rigorous. Responsibility begins with concrete human beings, not with slogans. One does not defend humanity by destroying humans. The idea that suffering can be justified by its political usefulness is precisely what Camus rejects. This refusal isolates Camus. He becomes politically homeless, distrusted by the right for condemning colonial oppression, and despised by the left for refusing to sanctify violence. Camus accepts this isolation because it is the price of refusing moral shortcuts. Responsibility often leads to solitude. Despite this severity, Camus is not indifferent to solidarity. On the contrary, responsibility binds human beings together more tightly than ideology ever could. Because there is no higher meaning, we become each other's only measure. Because there is no guaranteed justice, We become responsible for creating as much justice as possible without creating new victims. This is why Camus insists that responsibility must be continuous. It is not a one-time decision. One must judge again and again under changing circumstances without relying on formulas. Responsibility is not obedience to a rule, it is vigilance. Camus' ethics therefore reject both resignation and fanaticism. Resignation abandons responsibility by declaring action pointless. Fanaticism abandons responsibility by declaring action necessary at any cost. Camus occupies the narrow space between them, where action is possible but never absolute. This space is defined by refusal to lie, refusal to excuse murder, refusal to surrender judgment, refusal to allow necessity to replace conscience. These refusals are not negative gestures. They are affirmations of human dignity. Camus does not offer a system that guarantees right action. He offers a posture: remain awake, remain limited, remain responsible. Do not trade conscience for belonging. Do not exchange judgment for certainty. Responsibility for Camus is inseparable from revolt. Revolt is not about conquering the world. It is about refusing to become what the world makes easy. It is about preserving dignity under conditions that constantly threaten to erase it. Camus knows this is exhausting. Responsibility offers no rest. There is no final resolution, no moment when one can declare the work finished. Again and again, one must choose limits. Again and again, one must refuse alibis. Again and again, one must act without certainty. This is the price of living without appeal. It is also its dignity. Camus' moral responsibility does not promise redemption. It promises only that one can live without betraying oneself. In a world that constantly invites us to justify harm, this refusal is radical. Camus does not save the world. He insists that we not destroy it in the name of saving it. That is the full weight of moral responsibility in an absurd world.